On the night of her third wedding anniversary, Lady Alina Ashcombe stood alone beside the ballroom windows. While the rest of the room danced beneath golden candlelight, her husband had not arrived again. The whispers had started nearly an hour earlier. The Duke never attends with her. Poor thing. She looks as though she is waiting for a ghost. She was foolish to expect affection from Adrian Ravenshire. Alina kept her posture straight anyway, graceful, quiet, untouched, at least from the outside. Beyond the glass, rain streaked across the windows of Ravenshire Manor. Carriages lined the courtyard below. Music drifted through the ballroom in soft waves, but none of it reached her anymore. 3 years ago, she had entered this marriage believing patience could soften even the coldest heart. Now she understood something far crueler. Love could disappear quietly, not through cruelty, not through betrayal, but through silence. The grand doors finally opened. Conversations dimmed. The Duke of Ravenshire stepped inside, wearing black evening attire, still dusted with rain. Tall, composed, impossible to read, women glanced toward him immediately, men straightened. Even now, Adrian carried the sort of presence that silenced rooms without effort. His eyes found Alina almost instantly. For one brief second, something flickered across his face, regret perhaps, or exhaustion. Then it vanished. He crossed the ballroom slowly, while guests watched with open curiosity. Alina could already feel the humiliation gathering around her like smoke. Adrian stopped before her. "You should not have waited standing," he said quietly. "Not I am sorry, not you look beautiful, only that." Alina smiled gently, because she had learned how to survive disappointment elegantly. "The guests were beginning to worry you had forgotten. I was delayed in Parliament. Of course." He studied her face carefully then, as though searching for anger. But Alina no longer had the energy for anger. That frightened him more than he expected. Lord Whitmore approached moments later with a charming smile. "Your Grace," he greeted Alina warmly. "You have denied every dance tonight. Surely you cannot refuse me again." Before Alina could answer, Adrian spoke. "Wife is tired." Whitmore looked mildly embarrassed. Alina looked at Adrian calmly. "I am not tired." Stretched between them, a dangerous silence, because Adrian realized suddenly that she had contradicted him publicly, something she had never done before. Whitmore awkwardly offered his hand again. Alina accepted. And for the first time in 3 years, Adrian watched another man lead his wife onto the dance floor, while something dark and unfamiliar tightened painfully in his chest. Alina laughed softly at something Whitmore whispered during the dance. It was not a flirtatious laugh, not improper. But Adrian could not remember the last time he had heard that sound from her. Remained still beside the ballroom wall, while jealousy unfolded inside him slowly and quietly, like winter frost creeping across glass. Hours later, Alina returned to their carriage first. Rain hammered against the roof as she stared through the window into darkness. Adrian entered moments later. The carriage lurched forward, neither spoke. The silence between them felt endless now. Finally, Adrian said, "You seemed happy dancing with Whitmore." Alina kept her gaze outside. "It was only a dance. You dislike gossip. I once disliked many things." Her voice remained soft. That somehow hurt more. Adrian looked toward her carefully. For years, Alina had waited for scraps of affection with heartbreaking patience. Tonight, she seemed distant, untouchable. and he realized with sudden unease that he did not know how to reach her once she stopped reaching for him first. Winter settled heavily over Ravenshire Estate. Snow covered the gardens in pale silence, while Alina spent more and more time away from the main house. At first Adrian barely noticed. He left before breakfast, returned after dark, buried himself in estate affairs and parliamentary meetings. Duty had always been simpler than emotion. But slowly, the absence began appearing everywhere. The music room remained closed. Fresh flowers no longer appeared in his study. The quiet sound of Alina reading beside the fire disappeared from evenings entirely. One snowy morning, Adrian entered the breakfast room and found only cold tea waiting for him. "Where is the Duchess?" he asked. The servant hesitated. "Her Grace left early for the village school, Your Grace." Adrian frowned slightly. "She has gone there often." "Yes, Your Grace," said nothing more, though irritation lingered with him throughout the day. That evening, he rode through heavy snowfall toward the village. Unexpectedly, warm candlelight glowed through the schoolhouse windows. Inside, Alina sat beside a little girl, helping her practice writing. She looked different there, lighter somehow. The children smiled around her freely. Even the villagers greeted her with genuine affection. Adrian remained outside unnoticed for several moments. Then Alina looked up. Surprise crossed her face immediately, not joy, not warmth, only surprise. "You rode in this weather. You did not return home." The words sounded colder than intended. Alina stood slowly. The roads were worsening. "I stayed until the lesson ended." Little girl tugged Alina's sleeve innocently. "Will you still come tomorrow, Duchess?" Alina smiled softly. Adrian watched the exchange in silence. The child adored her. Of course she did. Everyone did outside. Snow fell heavily as they walked toward the carriage together. "You should have informed someone where you were," Adrian said. "I did. You did not inform me." Alina looked ahead calmly. "You are rarely home." The words landed harder than accusation because they were true inside the carriage. Silence returned. Then Alina quietly asked, "Did you need something from me tonight?" Adrian blinked slightly. "What? You came all this way?" Suddenly realized he had no answer. He had simply noticed her absence and hated it. That realization unsettled him deeply. Days later, society gathered for the winter masquerade in London. Alina wore silver silk and a delicate mask that made her almost unrecognizable beneath candlelight. Adrian watched her from across the ballroom all evening. Men gathered around her constantly, not because she encouraged them, because she finally seemed unreachable. And people always desired what appeared distant. Lady Harriet Langford approached Adrian with a knowing smile. "Your wife has become rather admired lately." Adrian's expression hardened slightly. "She has always been admired. Not like this." Harriet sipped champagne slowly. "She looks happy now." The comment lingered unpleasantly. Later that evening, Adrian crossed the ballroom just as Lord Whitmore kissed Alina's gloved hand. Too long, too familiar, Adrian stepped between them without invitation. "Lord Whitmore." Whitmore immediately stepped back. Alina looked up at Adrian in visible surprise. "Your Grace." "Come dance with me." Was not a request. The orchestra had already begun another waltz. Alina hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. The room watched openly, because the Duke of Ravenshire never danced. not even with his own wife. Adrian pulled her closer than necessary as they moved across the ballroom floor. "You encourage him," he said quietly. Alina looked genuinely confused. "I was speaking politely. He watches you constantly." "Whose fault is that?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Alina said softly, "You left me alone for years, Adrian. People eventually stop avoiding what appears abandoned." The words struck something deep inside him. His hand tightened instinctively around hers. Alina felt it. So did he. And suddenly, the dance no longer felt safe for either of them. Spring arrived slowly, bringing rainstorms and restless winds across London. By then, Alina had stopped waiting for Adrian in the evenings entirely. That change disturbed him more than anger ever could. She no longer asked when he would return, no longer searched his face for warmth, no longer brightened when he entered a room instead. She had become calm, independent, and terribly difficult to read. One afternoon, Adrian returned unexpectedly early and heard laughter echoing from the library. He paused outside the door. Alina sat near the windows playing chess with Lord Whitmore, while sunlight filtered softly through the curtains. Whitmore was smiling openly. Alina looked relaxed, in a way Adrian had never managed to inspire. The sight unsettled him instantly. Whitmore stood upon noticing Adrian. "Your Grace." Adrian's gaze moved toward the chessboard. "You visit frequently." Whitmore answered carefully. The Duchess invited several guests for the charity committee. Several guests. Yet the room was empty except for them. Alina closed the chessboard quietly. Lord Whitmore was leaving. Whitmore bowed politely and departed without argument. The silence afterward felt suffocating. Adrian approached slowly. "You spend much time with him." Alina met his gaze evenly. "And you spend much time avoiding me. That is unfair." A faint sadness crossed her face. "No, Adrian, it is merely late." Stared at her late. The word lingered heavily between them. Alina moved toward the bookshelf calmly. "When we first married, I thought if I remained patient long enough, you might someday love me openly." Adrian's chest tightened unexpectedly. She continued softly, "But people grow tired of standing outside locked doors." Stepped closer instinctively. "You think I do not care for you?" Alina looked at him then, really looked at him. For years, I could not tell. Honesty in her voice cut deeper than accusation ever could. That night, Adrian could not sleep. Rain battered the manor windows, while memories returned relentlessly. Alina waiting beside fireplaces. Alina watching doorways during dinners. Alina pretending not to notice his distance. He had believed she would always remain there quietly beside him. Now he saw how fragile that assumption had been. Days later, society gathered at Hyde Park for a spring promenade. Alina walked beside Lady Harriet, while gentlemen greeted her constantly. Adrian watched from a distance during conversation with several politicians. Then he saw Whitmore offer Alina his coat when rain suddenly began falling. A small gesture, simple, natural. Yet Adrian felt irrational anger rise sharply inside him. Before he realized it, he had already crossed the crowded walkway. "I will take my wife home." Whitmore looked startled. Alina looked even more so. "We had only just arrived," she said quietly. "The weather is worsening." "It is only rain." Adrian's voice lowered dangerously. "Alina." The tension between them became instantly visible. Nearby conversations softened. People noticed. Alina slowly handed Whitmore the borrowed coat. "Thank you, my lord." Then she walked toward the carriage without another word inside. Rain streaked across the windows, while silence pressed heavily between them. Finally, Alina spoke. "You embarrassed him publicly." Stared ahead. "I disliked seeing another man care for you." The confession slipped out before he could stop it. Alina turned toward him slowly. For the first time in years, genuine emotion cracked through his composure, jealousy, fear, possession. And beneath all of it, something much more vulnerable. Her voice softened slightly. "You had years to care for me openly." Adrian looked toward her then. Rain shadows crossed his face. "I did care. You hid it too well." Those words followed him long after the carriage disappeared into the storm. The separation request arrived 2 weeks later. Adrian found the letter waiting in his study, beside untouched breakfast tea. His hands remained still for several seconds after reading it. Then he read it again. And again. "The Duchess of Ravenshire respectfully requests temporary residence at Rosehill Cottage for the summer season. No anger, no dramatic accusations, only unbearable politeness." Adrian rode to Alina's chambers immediately. She stood near the open windows, while servants packed books into traveling trunks. For one horrible moment, the sight reminded him of loss, permanent loss. "You are leaving," Alina turned calmly, "for the summer. You did not discuss this with me. You rarely discuss anything with me." Quietness in her voice frightened him more each day. Adrian stepped closer. "People will talk. They already do. That does not mean I will permit this." Flickered painfully across Alina's expression. Permit. The word exposed everything wrong between them at once. Adrian saw it immediately. So did she. He softened his tone slightly. "That is not what I meant. But it is what you feel." Alina closed another trunk gently. "I cannot continue living like a guest in my own marriage." His throat tightened unexpectedly. "You would leave because I struggle to speak affection aloud." "No." She looked at him with heartbreaking calm. "I would leave because I am slowly disappearing here." The room fell silent. Adrian suddenly noticed how tired she looked, not physically, emotionally, like someone who had spent years carrying loneliness quietly. He moved closer again. "Alina." But he did not know how to finish the sentence. She waited anyway. Part of her still hoped. That was the cruelest part. Finally, Adrian said softly, "Stay." Only one word, but it came too late. Tears briefly filled Alina's eyes before she looked away. "You should have asked sooner." Days later, she departed for Rosehill Cottage. The manor became unbearable afterward. Too quiet, too large. Adrian found himself searching for her unconsciously. Her shawl remained draped over the music room chair. A pressed flower rested forgotten inside one of his books. Her absence lived everywhere now. Weeks passed. Then society gossip worsened. People noticed Alina smiling again, riding through the countryside with friends, hosting garden parties. Meanwhile, Adrian became colder than ever in London. One evening, Lord Ashford casually remarked during dinner, "Your wife seems quite happy away from Ravenshire." Set down his glass too hard. The sound silenced the table. That night, he rode 4 hours through rain toward Rosehill. By the time he arrived, midnight shadows covered the cottage. Warm light glowed from one downstairs window. Adrian entered quietly, then stopped. Alina had fallen asleep in the sitting room beside the fire, with a book resting against her chest. She looked peaceful, more peaceful than he had seen in years. Something inside him broke quietly at that sight, because he realized with painful clarity that she breathed easier without him. The floorboard creaked beneath his step. Alina woke, suddenly. Shock crossed her face. Adrian. He moved toward her slowly. You seem happier here. Alina sat upright carefully. I am learning how not to wait anymore. The words struck him harder than any rejection. He knelt beside her chair before pride could stop him. It startled them both. I do not know how to be the man you deserve, he admitted quietly. Her eyes softened with visible pain. That is the first honest thing you have ever said to me. Rain whispered softly against the cottage windows, while Adrian looked at her like a man terrified of losing the last good thing in his life. And for the first time, Alina saw fear in her husband's eyes, real fear. After Rosehill, Adrian began changing in ways society immediately noticed. He attended fewer political gatherings, returned to Ravenshire less often, and traveled constantly between London and the countryside under increasingly thin excuses. At first, Alina did not trust it. How could she 3 years of silence could not disappear overnight? Yet slowly, carefully, Adrian began showing affection in ways that felt almost painfully sincere. He remembered her favorite flowers, listened when she spoke, walked beside her through the gardens without rushing ahead. Small things, dangerously meaningful things. One evening, they attended a summer concert beneath lantern light. Music drifted softly through the warm night air, while nobles mingled across the estate gardens. Alina stood near the roses, speaking with guests, when Lady Harriet approached quietly. The Duke watches you, as though someone might steal you away. Alina glanced across the garden. Instinctively, Adrian stood beneath the lanterns, speaking with several gentlemen. Yet his eyes remained fixed on her. Harriet smiled faintly. He looks miserable whenever another man approaches. Alina looked away quickly. Part of her still longed for him desperately. Another part remained guarded, because hope had once ruined her. Later that evening, Lord Whitmore requested another dance. Alina accepted politely. As they crossed the floor, Whitmore said carefully, Forgive my boldness, Duchess, but Ravenshire appears very changed lately. He is trying. Does that heal what came before? Alina hesitated. I do not know yet. Across the ballroom, Adrian watched them together with restrained tension. Jealousy had become a constant ache now. Not because he distrusted Alina, because he feared realizing too late how easily another man could love her properly. When the dance ended, Adrian approached immediately. May I have the next dance? Whitmore looked genuinely stunned. So did Alina. Adrian ignored both reactions. Alina slowly placed her hand in his. The orchestra began another waltz. This time, Adrian held her carefully, not possessively, tenderly. You are quiet tonight, Alina murmured. I am thinking. Dangerous. A faint smile almost appeared on his face, almost. Then he said quietly, I used to believe love weakened judgment. Alina looked up at him. Now, his gaze remained fixed on her. Now, I believe the absence of it ruins everything. Breath caught softly. The honesty in his voice felt unfamiliar, fragile. Adrian continued after a long silence. When you left Ravenshire, I realized I no longer recognized my own life without you in it. Emotion flickered across Aliner's face. For years, she had begged silently for crumbs of affection. Now, he offered truths too late. And yet her heart still responded to every word that frightened her deeply. After the dance ended, whispers followed them everywhere, because the Duke of Ravenshire had looked at his wife like a man in love. And everyone noticed, except the woman who still feared believing it. Autumn arrived with sharp winds and golden leaves. For a brief time, Alina almost allowed herself hope again. Then came the rumor. It spread through London within days. The Duke of Ravenshire was expected to secure a powerful political alliance through Lady Beatrice Holloway. The story sounded absurd until Alina attended a luncheon and overheard Lady Beatrice herself speaking confidently. Grace understands duty above sentiment. The words hollowed something inside Alina instantly, because that had always been true. Adrian valued duty first, always. That evening, Alina returned home quietly. Adrian found her standing beside the fireplace after midnight. "You are awake late." She turned slowly. "Are you pursuing an alliance with Lady Beatrice's family?" Confusion crossed his face. "What? The entire city seems aware of it." Realization darkened his expression immediately. "No, you allowed the rumor to spread. It benefits parliamentary negotiations." Alina laughed softly then, a sad sound. "There it is again." "What duty?" Adrian stepped toward her. "The rumor means nothing. But it always means more than I do." The pain in her voice stunned him silent. For years, he had never fully understood how deeply his choices wounded her. Now every careless action returned like ghosts. Alina moved toward the door. "I am tired," Adrian caught her wrist gently before she could leave, not forcefully, desperately. "You matter to me." She looked down at his hand, trembling slightly around hers. For the first time, she realized he truly feared losing her. Yet fear alone could not heal years of loneliness. Her voice weakened softly. "I wanted to matter before I stopped loving you." The words shattered him completely. Alina immediately regretted saying them aloud, because his expression changed instantly. All composure disappeared. He looked devastated. "What do you mean?" Tears filled her eyes despite herself. "I do not know how much of me is left anymore." Adrian released her wrist slowly, as though burned. That night, he remained awake until dawn. And for the first time in his life, the Duke of Ravenshire understood helplessness, not political helplessness, not financial concern, emotional helplessness, because the woman he loved was slipping away quietly. And he had taught her how. Days later, Alina attended a countryside gathering without him. Rain fell heavily that evening. During dinner, Whitmore noticed Alina shivering near the terrace doors and silently draped his coat around her shoulders. A simple kindness. Yet, when Adrian arrived unexpectedly moments later, the sight nearly destroyed what remained of his restraint. Everyone noticed his expression immediately. Jealousy, raw and visible. Alina removed the coat at once. But Adrian's gaze remained fixed on Whitmore. The carriage ride home burned with silence. Finally, Adrian spoke hoarsely. "I cannot bear seeing another man care for you." Stared through rain-covered glass. "You should have thought of that years ago." The first snow fell the night Alina collapsed. She had ignored exhaustion for weeks, while organizing winter charity events across London. By the time Adrian arrived home, Doctors already filled the manor. Fear hit him so violently, he nearly stopped breathing. He found Alina unconscious beneath pale candlelight, her skin cold against white pillows. The physician rose quickly. She has driven herself beyond proper rest. Fever worsened it. Adrian sat beside the bed without removing his gloves. For hours, he did not move. Servants quietly exchanged worried glances outside the room. No one had ever seen the Duke look afraid before. Near dawn, Alina finally stirred weakly. Her eyes opened slowly. Adrian leaned forward instantly. Relief crossed his face, so openly it startled her. "You frightened me." His voice sounded rough, unsteady. Alina tried to sit upright. "You should rest," he said immediately, helping her carefully. The tenderness in his hands nearly hurt more than coldness once had, because now she could see the love he had hidden for years, and because part of her no longer trusted it fully. Snow drifted quietly beyond the windows, while Adrian remained beside her through the night. At one point, Alina woke to find him asleep in the chair, one hand still loosely holding hers. She stared at him silently. Even sleeping, he looked burdened, guarded, as though loving someone frightened him. Morning light eventually filled the room. Adrian opened his eyes slowly and realized Alina was watching him. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then he said quietly, "I thought I had lost you." Emotion tightened his voice unexpectedly. Alina's heart ached. "You would survive." "No." Answer came instantly, completely honest. Adrian leaned closer. "When you left Ravenshire, I told myself I could endure it because you were still somewhere in this world." His hand tightened gently around hers. "Last night, I understood something unbearable." Barely breathed. "If you stopped loving me entirely," he swallowed hard, "I do not think there would be much left of me afterward." Filled her eyes immediately, because after years of silence, he finally sounded like the man she had once prayed existed beneath all that restraint. Adrian lowered his forehead against her hands softly. "I loved you badly," he whispered. The confession broke something open between them, not perfectly, not instantly, but honestly. And honesty changed everything. By spring, London society no longer recognized the Duke of Ravenshire. He smiled now, rarely but genuinely. He attended concerts with Alina, walked beside her openly, danced with her without needing invitation. Most shocking of all, he looked at her constantly, like a man still afraid she might disappear. One evening, Ravenshire Manor hosted its first grand spring ball in years. Candlelight shimmered across marble floors, while music drifted through crowded halls. Alina descended the staircase, wearing pale blue silk. Conversations softened immediately. Adrian stood waiting below, and for a moment, the entire ballroom disappeared around him. She stopped before him with quiet grace. "You are starring, Your Grace." "I know." Warm amusement flickered in her eyes. Months ago, she would have hidden her happiness carefully. Now she allowed herself to feel it. That was the true difference. Not merely Adrian's transformation, her own. She no longer begged silently for affection, no longer diminished herself to earn love. And perhaps that was why Adrian cherished her so fiercely now, because he finally understood what it meant to almost lose her. The orchestra began another waltz. Adrian extended his hand. "Dance with me, Alina." Before, his words had sounded restrained, controlled. Tonight they sounded almost vulnerable. She placed her hand in his. As they moved across the ballroom floor, guests watched with open fascination, not because the Duke danced, but because he looked utterly devoted to his wife. Adrian drew her closer carefully. There was a time I believed silence protected dignity. Alina looked up at him softly. And now I think silence nearly cost me the love of my life. Emotion tightened in her chest. The ballroom blurred around them. Only him remained. Adrian's voice lowered quietly. I spent years believing duty mattered more than affection, because affection frightened me. She listened silently. You deserved warmth, he continued. Instead, I gave you distance and expected patience to survive it forever. His eyes held her steadily now, no walls, no avoidance, only truth. I will regret that for the rest of my life. Alina felt tears threaten again, but these tears felt different, healing, instead of lonely. Adrian stopped dancing suddenly, though the music continued around them. The movement startled nearby couples slightly. Then, before an entire ballroom of watching nobility, the Duke of Ravenshire lifted Alina's hand gently to his lips, not for appearance, not for duty, for love, openly. I love you, he said quietly, 3 words, simple, late, and utterly devastating. Alina stared at him as emotion overwhelmed years of heartbreak all at once. For so long, she had imagined hearing those words. Then, eventually, she had forced herself to stop hopping. Now they reached her when she no longer needed them to survive, which somehow made them real. Her fingers tightened softly around his. You took very long to say it. A faint smile finally appeared on Adrian's face. I know. The orchestra continued playing softly, while candlelight glowed around them. And for the first time since their marriage began, Alina no longer felt alone standing beside her husband. She felt chosen, seen, loved, not quietly, not secretly, but fully. Outside, spring rain began falling gently over Ravenshire Manor, while warmth and music filled the ballroom windows. And this time, when Adrian looked at his wife, he did not hide the tenderness in his eyes, because he had finally learned that love was not something to protect from the world. It was something to give before silence stole the chance forever.